Good evening and welcome. My name is Carla Durand, and on behalf of the Collegeville Institute for Ecumenical and Cultural Research, St. John's Abbey, and St. Benedict's Monastery, I'd like to welcome each of you here to this evening's presentation entitled A Painting, a Parable, and My Friend Henri Nouwen. Before we get into the program, I have two logistical points to mention. First, we'll be watching a little clip in tonight's presentation about Henri Nouwen. And we do have the full DVD in the back of the room here, and we're selling them for $20. If, however, you are a student and most of your cash goes toward tuition or books, let me know and we can work with you on a sliding scale. The point being that if you want a DVD, we want you to have one. And then two, the formal part of this presentation will end at about 9 o'clock. So I'm going to kind of keep my eye on the clock. So if you have something else going on in the evening and you need to leave at 9 o'clock, you can do that. And then for those of you who would like to stay for questions and discussion, we'll have about 20 or 25 minutes after that with our presenter. Okay? So with that, it is my distinct privilege and honor to introduce our speaker tonight, Sister Sue Mosteller. Sue hails from Ohio, yet in 8th grade went to boarding school with the Sisters of St. Joseph of Toronto. She entered the order after finishing high school. Later, while teaching, she heard a lecture by Jean Vanier, the founder of the L'Arche Communities, which is an international network of faith-based communities for those with developmental difficulties. Sue says that she was so moved in her heart by Vanier that in 1972 she began working with the L'Arche Daybreak community in Toronto. In 1976, she became L'Arche Daybreak's second community leader, and a few years after that, she was named the first international coordinator for L'Arche after Jean Vanier himself. In 1986, Father Henri Nouwen, a Dutch priest and professor, came to live at L'Arche Daybreak and lived there for 10 years until his death in 1996. During that 10-year period, Sue and Henri became close friends. His confidence and trust in Sue was so great that he entrusted her with his estate, naming her the literary executrix of his works upon his death. Sue is also a trustee on the board of the Henri Nouwen Legacy Trust. Sue holds a degree from Toronto Teachers College, a BA in English Literature from St. Michael's College, University of Toronto, and 4 honorary doctorate degrees, one from Regis College at the University of Toronto, Aquinas College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto, and Tyndale University College and Seminary in Toronto. Sue has written 3 books. Her first book, My Brother, My Sister, is about Jean Vanier and Mother Teresa. Her second book, Body Broken, Body Blessed, is a collection of stories from L'Arche. And her third book, Light Through the Crack, Life After Loss, is her own story and the stories of people she has accompanied over the years. Sue continues to be a wise and inspiring spiritual leader, giving retreats and lectures around the world. Of her life to date, she says, "My life journey has been one with wonderful and amazing people, some of whom were disabled, and all of whom shaped my transformation. They demonstrated that love is possible, God's forgiveness is essential, and we are called to walk together on earth." We are so pleased to have Sue join us as a resident scholar this semester at the Collegeville Institute. And we are very fortunate to have her on campus with us through the end of April. She is an incredibly warm, generous, and kind woman. Please join me in welcoming Sue Mosteller.
Thank you. It's a joy to be here, and it's a greater joy to talk about Henri and about the painting and about the parable. And my problem is not so much what I should say as what I should not say, because I could tell a story about practically every little event along the way. So tonight we're going to talk about a painting, a parable, and Henri. And I'd like to say a little word about each of those things before we get into the content of my lecture. And I'm going to go backwards. I'm going to speak about my friend Henri. Henri, as you know, or maybe you know, was a Dutch priest. He came to the United States to study at the Menninger Clinic. He told his bishop after ordination that he wanted to study psychology because he wanted to understand what made people tick so that he could be a better pastor. He spent 2 years there, and he said, under the tutelage of Karl Menninger, and he said they were very, very formative years for him. And then he was invited by Notre Dame to open the psychology department there in 1966. And he went to Notre Dame, and he stayed there for 2 years teaching psychology, but he quickly was invited to work with seminarians and to teach theology. And he liked theology better than psychology. So he didn't ever go back and teach psychology again. He then went back to Holland for 6 years, and then Yale Divinity School invited him to come over, and he thought it was for a visit, and he came and had a lovely visit, and he said they kept asking me a lot of questions and couldn't figure it out. And then when I got home, I got a letter from them saying I had been accepted as a professor. They were interviewing him, and he wasn't even sure that's what was happening. So he taught at Yale for 10 years. And I want to say that during that time, he really became quite successful. They loved his classes. He started writing very, very early, and his classes and his talks would come out of the experiences that he was living. And people came, the classes grew and became larger and larger. And then he was asked to lecture, and he accompanied a number of people pastorally and became friends with, well, at his funeral we said his 1,200 best friends came, besides all the other thousands of people that came, but he a lot of close friends. I knew him as a friend, and I want to say this about him. He was a man who had an amazing combination of gifts. He was highly intelligent and very, very well read, but he was also deeply sensitive and very, very passionate. Passionate about the gospel, passionate about spiritual things, passionate about life, passionate about art. So he had a very, very wide range. And somehow he was able to hold that all together. He could talk about anything, and he was so interested to talk about movies and art and reading and books and people and the world and politics, and he was eager about life. I discovered in the years that we were together that Henri was also a man who suffered. And that was something that wasn't known to a wide range of people, except that he began to write about that in his books. I think if I had known then what I understand about him now, I would have been a lot more compassionate when we were living in the community together, because he was an anguished man. He had a very, very deep cry within him, and he couldn't ever satisfy it. I met his father after he died, his 94-year-old father, and he told me from the crib, he cried out asking, "Do you love me? Do you love me?" He said, we answered him, "Of course we love you." But he just kept asking the question, "Do you love me?" And somehow that deep need for affection and for love was hardly realized for him, and he suffered a lot. And I think, John Vanier said at his funeral, and I thought it was just perfect, he said, his anguish fueled his genius. And I think that was true. I think people loved his books because he gave them permission to be weak and vulnerable. He talked about some of his own life and some of his own suffering, and he was able to say, so this is what I live, and this is how I'm working on it. And he wrote over 40 books. He's been dead 15 years, and they're all still in print, except one. So he touches a chord in people when he writes about the spiritual life. I knew him also as a man of courage, and I'll tell you that during those years when he was so popular at Yale, and when people were flocking to his classes, and people were coming to visit him at Yale to speak to him, he, from this inner place, was worried that he wasn't following Jesus. And in this very, very successful career with full tenure after 3 years and full professorship after 5 years, after 6 or 7 years, he took a whole semester and he went to the Genesee Abbey to just be still and to listen to God. And one of his best books came from that time, called The Genesee Diary. And he writes about his loneliness and about, Abbot Bamberger, who was the abbot at the time and Henri's counselor. He has many things to say about Henri. He said he was so eager about everything, but then when we'd ask him, he wanted to be a monk, but then when we asked him to, load the rocks for the church, then he was upset with us. And when he had to pick over the raisins and make sure there were no stones in the raisins for going into the bread, he said, "Why am I doing this? This is hopeless work. I don't want to do this anymore." So I think the abbot wondered about his stability a little bit. But from that time of trying to listen to the voice that's calling him to something else, he decided after 10 years to give up his tenure. And he wasn't quite sure that he knew exactly what God wanted, but he had connected with the Maryknoll Fathers, and he went to South America to be a pastor in Peru. The Maryknoll Fathers told him after 6 months or so that wasn't his greatest gift, and maybe he should come back to North America. But the courage to give it up and to follow what he thought Jesus was calling him to, and he was in a whole time of search. So I think he was a man of courage who made choices trying to be faithful with all that he was living, and I admired him for that. When he was 54 years old, he came to live in our community of L'Arche Daybreak with people with intellectual disabilities and young people and older people, married people, single people, forming community around those who can't make it on their own. And he came to be our pastor. Our community was an ecumenical community and an interfaith community. And we didn't quite know how to live spiritually. We were an intentional faith community, but we weren't certain how to worship, and we weren't certain. We were wounding one another in terms of what we were trying to do spiritually. And Henri came, and really so much wisdom, so much listening, so much depth. Again, his gift was not to live in community. He was hopeless. But he had this pastoral heart. He could listen, and he could guide us. And in those 10 years, I want to say that he was transformed. I was transformed. And our community really kind of stood up and said, we're here and we have a mission and we want to be faithful. And it's not simple, but God has invited us to this and we want to live it as well as we can. So that's all I want to say about Henri, but he was a friend and I loved him a lot. He was horrible too and difficult to live with. And I'm sure he would say the same about me. But everybody at Daybreak loved him, even though he was hopeless. At 6 o'clock in the morning, his alarm would go off and bang, crash, and the door and the shower would be on and clamping around and banging the doors and tell him 300 times. He'd say, oh, I'm really sorry. Okay, I'll think about that. And the next morning, crash, bang. But he grinding their teeth at him. And the next word I want to talk about is this 2,000-year-old parable that Henri discovered at a time in his life when he was broken. A year and a half after he came to Daybreak, Henri had a nervous breakdown. And he crashed very badly. He was non-functional. And again, he had to go away for a time. And in that time away, trying to find himself and trying to recover from a very, very profound inner brokenness, he looked at this painting and he read that parable. And basically, he spent hours and hours deepening, going farther and farther into the meaning of this parable. Jesus gave us this parable out of his heart, and he wanted to tell us something. And I never knew about it until Henri began to talk about it. And again, with his passion and his depth and his insight and his creativity, he was able to really open doors. He wrote a book called The Return of the Prodigal Son, and it's a classic. It's probably one of his best books. And the second book on the same topic, which is called Home Tonight, is the edited text of talks that Henri gave on the prodigal son, and it's also beautiful. It's a little more personal than Henri's book. It's a beautiful book. Finally, I want to say a word about this 350-year-old painting. So we have a 350-year-old painting, a 2,000-year-old parable, and an 80-year-old, would-be 80-year-old man that we're going to talk about. But this painting, I'd like to ask first of all, I'd like to read something that Henri wrote about the painting. He loved art, and he loved the Dutch artists, Van Gogh and Rembrandt. And this is what he wrote about the painting. He said, "In my struggle to move from Harvard to L'Arche and from L'Arche to Harvard, I came to know this picture. And at that moment, something happened to me. It was something I'm still unable to articulate, but I saw this picture and I knew I was seeing something I needed to see that had enormous value for me. I saw that this father touched his child, not only with affection, but in a way that was also a profound blessing, of a nature that touched my own heart's deep search." Rembrandt painted this painting in 1665, at the end of his life. It is painted by a man who knew what suffering was and had an immense loneliness in his life. At one time, Rembrandt was a very successful painter who was asked to do portraits of everyone in Amsterdam. But gradually, he experienced his life being taken away. He first lost his son, then his first daughter, then his second daughter, then his wife. After that, he lived with a woman who went to a mental hospital. Then he married a second woman who died long before he did. Finally, just before he himself died, his favorite son, Titus, died. This was a man who could have become the most bitter, angry, resentful person because he had died so many deaths. But finally, he was able to paint this most intimate painting, the return of the prodigal son. He was able to paint the mercy of a blind father. This is not a painting he painted when he was young and successful. This was the painting he painted when he was totally unpopular and had lost everything, all his children, 2 of his wives, and all his money. He painted this from a place in himself, knowing what God's mercy was. His suffering had emptied him out so that he could understand fully and deeply the mercy of God. When Vincent van Gogh saw this painting, he said, "You can only paint a painting like this when you have died many deaths." Rembrandt had died so many deaths that he finally knew what the return to God's mercy really was. I also thought you might just enjoy hearing Henri talk about this painting. So we have a little clip, and it's only about 3 or 4 minutes long, but it's a clip of Henri describing the painting. So we'll see that, and then I'll go on.
One of Henri's most important works was inspired by Rembrandt's painting, The Return of the Prodigal Son. In this book, he summarized some of the major themes which ran through his own life and work. In a recent issue of Oprah magazine, Hillary Clinton chose The Return of the Prodigal Son by Henri Nouwen as her favorite book.
When I saw the poster of the Rembrandt painting in which the father embraces his returning son, I was totally overwhelmed. And when I saw this embrace, I said, that's where I want to be. And out of that, I started to think about myself as the prodigal son that wanted to return home. But then I started to study the painting, and I went all the way to St. Petersburg to see the original painting of Rembrandt. The older son suddenly started to speak to me. That I'm the older son myself, in my family. That there was a lot of resentment in me, a lot of not fully enjoying being in the church. And so I suddenly discovered I was these 2 sons, both. And then something incredibly important happened. I got very depressed, and I had to take some time away. And one member of my community came to visit me. And she said, Henri, you're talking about yourself being the younger son, and you're talking about yourself being the older son, but you have to be the father now. That's who you're called to be, the father. And look at the father in the painting. Look, the father has a hand of a mother and a hand of a father. Has a male hand and a female hand touching the son. Look at the father who is like a mother with a big cloak, like the mother bird who holds his young safe. Look at the father who wants to welcome his son back without asking any questions. The father doesn't even want to hear the story of the younger son. The father doesn't even want to hear the story of the older son. He wants them to be back home on the same table with him, so that they can grow up and become like him. And I suddenly discovered my final vocation is to not only to go home, but to bring people home by saying, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad you're here. Just get out the beautiful ring and get out the sandals and get all. Let's say I am the beloved Son of God. That I am the beloved child of God. I'm really grateful to be with you here this morning and to share my faith with you. And to the core of that faith belongs my conviction that you and that I and that we are the beloved daughters and sons of God.
Thanks. That was his conclusion. That you and that I are the beloved daughters and sons of God. And somewhere that touched that place in Henri where the anguish was. There was an answer there somewhere. If I could only trust that that is true, then I could become like the Father. If I know that I am unconditionally loved, then I am able then to love others in the same way and with the same goodness and mercy that the Father can do. And so Henri took that, and for the next years of his life, his main message was to tell us, you are the beloved daughters and sons of God. And in all the readings, he'd always come back to it. And he just loved the baptism of Jesus, where Jesus goes down into the water and comes up, and he hears the voice. And the voice says, you are my beloved Son. And then the Holy Spirit leads Jesus into the desert to be tested about whether he believed that or not. So, you're hungry, do something relevant. Do something, and then you're going to be somebody. And Jesus said, I don't have to do anything because I know that I'm somebody. And the second temptation, if you jump off the tower, everybody's going to think you're great. So you're going to have a wonderful reputation, and what others think of you is very, very important. So do that, and then you'll really be somebody. Jesus said, I don't have to be somebody because I am somebody. I am God's beloved Son. And the third temptation, you can have everything. It's all yours. Power, money, everything. It's all yours. Jesus said, I don't have to have everything because I already know the most important thing. I am God's beloved Son. And then Henri would go on and he'd point to the places in St. John's Gospel where Jesus says to the disciples, as the Father has loved me, I love you. And because it was such a challenge for Henri, he just couldn't let go of it because he was trying to believe it and he was trying to stand up and to become the Father. He saw that as a real call. That was what he got from the painting. You are the beloved daughters and sons of God. And that's the truth. So I want to talk about the parable because the parable will help us. And I want to talk about it, but first I want to tell a story. And that is that one day we were at a meeting in Ottawa, and we had an afternoon free, and Henri said, let's go to the art museum. And I said, okay. So I am not the greatest art critic. So I went to the museum, and I had been to museums, so I thought we would walk around and see. And so as soon as we got there, he said, okay, there's a painting I want to see on the second floor. And I said, okay. So we went up. And in the museum, they have the benches, and then there's a very wide aisle, and then the pictures are on the wall. And people kind of walk down the aisle, and there's these little cards that tell you the painter and the year and where and so on. And So he didn't go up to the painting. He said, "That's it," and he sat down on the bench. So I sat down beside him, and so there's this very wide aisle, and the painting was about this big. It wasn't huge. So I was looking at the painting, and very beautiful Van Gogh painting in the south of France, and it was light. The light was lovely, and so people were walking by, and 5 minutes, and so I kept looking. 10 minutes, and so I was sort of peeking to see what he was doing, and he was just sitting there so happily, just staring at the picture. So 15 minutes, and I'm like, finally, after about 20 minutes, I turned to him and I said, "Could you just tell me, what are you doing?" I said, "Explain it to me." I said, "I'm crazy. I don't know what you're doing. What do you see? Tell me." He's sort of very surprised. He said, "Oh." He said, "Well, are you in the picture?" And I said, "Pardon?" He said, "Are you in the picture?" And I said, "No." "Oh, well," he said, "you have to get in the picture." He said, you step in and walk around, and then you'll begin to see." And he said, that's what I'm doing. He said, I'm walking around in the south of France. I still didn't do it very well. It was too small, and I couldn't see it well enough. My glasses weren't strong or something, but anyway. But when he started talking about this painting, then I began to understand. Because we don't understand it until we get in it. So I'm going to talk about the characters, but I just invite you, insofar as you're able, to step into it and to begin to walk around and to identify with the people. That's what he did. He stepped into the painting and he became the younger son. And then he became the older son in his own right, not in the right of the one who is painted there. First he saw who that one was, but then he himself became with his life. So let's begin to look at the characters for a moment. So the younger son is there in the parable. He's a normal adolescent whose house is too small, and he wants out, and he wants some freedom, and he needs some money. He's impatient and he's intolerant, and probably that's the way most young people are. He doesn't do it very well. In fact, he insults his father when he asks for his inheritance, because what he's basically saying is, "I can't wait for you to die. I wish you were dead, but you're not. So could you please give me my share, because I need to get out of here?" So he wasn't wise, and he takes off and he goes far from home, and he squanders his inheritance. In some ways it's sort of normal behavior, but in other ways it's so unwise. And he doesn't know his father. He hasn't really looked at him, and he doesn't know him. So he wants pleasure, and he squanders his inheritance, and he gets farther and farther away, and pretty soon he's lost. He lost his money. He lost all his friends when he lost his money. And then he starts feeding the pigs. And it says in the parable that Jesus gave us, he came to his senses, but not terribly clearly. My father has many servants who are eating more than I am. Maybe I could go back and be a servant. He doesn't know his father. He doesn't know him. So he returns, and on his return, he's making a speech to say to his father. But this is a return home. And when we go home, we don't make speeches in our home. We don't make speeches to one another. That's what he's doing. It's the disconnect. He's disconnected from home. He's returning, but he's disconnected. So he comes home, and what he discovers is not what he was expecting. His father meets him and brings him in. And let's look for a moment at the elder son. He's the tall figure to the right. It seems that when Henri was identifying with the younger son and talking about it to his friends, they said, "You're not the younger son, you're the elder son." And he said, "I was so surprised." And I began to think about the elder son who stayed home. So he looks good. He's dutiful. He's running the estate with his father. And so he's the good guy. Everybody, the young runaway, he's taken off. But this guy, he's the good guy. But he's pretty shut down. And he's pretty judgmental. And he's quite angry. Henri says he was full of resentment. And he says resentment is cold anger. Angry with his brother, angry that he's stuck, angry that he has to do all the work. He's angry at the old man. And probably in his heart, too, he wishes that his father was dead so he could run the estate the way he wants to run it. The thing about this man being resentful means that he also was getting farther and farther away from the truth that he was the beloved son. He's removing himself, not physically, but certainly psychologically and emotionally, resentful and angry. And the difficulty for him is that he doesn't even know he's lost. Cold anger that sort of seeps out into all our relationships when we carry it in our hearts. His return is going to be harder, simply because he looks good, he stayed home, he's dutiful, he's done it all right. And that was Henri. He stayed in the church, he stayed faithful, he followed God's will, he did it all. But inwardly, kind of angry, upset, furious. The poet Rumi says, "Anger corrodes the vessel that holds it." I like that. So his heart was wizened up like a prune with anger. And when his father goes out and invites him to come to the celebration because his brother's home, he makes a speech. Again, pretty obvious that he's not at home. A very, very angry speech. "I've slaved for you all my life." So he doesn't see the father as father. He sees the father as boss. "You've never given me so much as a kid to entertain my friends. And when this son of yours comes home and has eaten up all your inheritance, you kill the fatted calf. Anger, anger, anger. He's very, very far from home. He's far from being the beloved. He refuses to go in and to be part of the family because the father is so stupid to welcome home that runaway. And it's interesting that Henri found an identification there. He was seen to be good, he was very successful, he was very popular, he had done it all right, he was faithful. And yet inside there was something that wasn't peaceful, and something about serving God as the boss and not as the Father. And I think it was in those hours of being alone and being broken that he began to discover that it wasn't the boss, that he had been created and shaped and formed and guided and loved for his whole life. And he could hardly believe it. It was, I would say, these were giant steps for him to stay there and to try to say yes. In some way, to always have the question, do you love me, is easier than to begin to step into the truth and say, it's true, I am beloved. I am the beloved of God as I am, with all the darkness and with all the light. That God loves me with an unconditional love. Henri was really able to identify, and I think that's something we can think about as we read the parable again. My self-righteous persona. I've got everybody pegged. So stupid. Why do they do that? There was a wonderful homily on Sunday, and Father Robert Pearson gave the homily, and it was so good. He talked about his self-righteousness. And we can judge the church, we can judge each other, and we don't realize that we're far from home. So possibly we also can identify a little bit. I want to say a word about the Father, and Henri really concentrated there. How did the Father treat the younger son? In the story, he comes and asks for his inheritance, and the father doesn't say anything. It just says he divided his inheritance, and he gave it to them, and he let him go. He was insulted, and he says nothing. Henri wrote something about that, and it's quite beautiful, and I love it, and you'll see why. Henri says, this is not a parent who says, don't go. That kind of statement is not in keeping with the spirit of the story. The spirit of the story reads, yes, son, go, and you will be hurt, and it will be hard, and it will be painful, and you might even lose your life. But I will not hold you back from taking that risk. When and if you come back, I am always here for you. But I'm also here for you now in your leaving. Yes, we belong together, and I am never separated from you. Henri says, I feel in our hearts it's good to be convinced somewhere of God's love and to risk leaving occasionally. I like that. Isn't it true there are times for us, as in life of the younger son, when we simply need to go off for a while? I believe the giver of life loves each of us as a daughter or a son who is returning and leaving constantly. Our minds wander away, but eventually return. Our hearts leave in search of affection and return, sometimes broken. Our bodies get carried away in their desires. Sooner or later, they return. It's never one dramatic life movement, but a constant series of departures and returns. We are beloved children of God. We are held safely by everlasting and unending love. It's normal for us then in growing up spiritually to live according to our nature. Yes, I'm loved, even when I take a risk to satisfy my desire, to claim my life. I'm loved, even when I make mistakes. I may have acted badly, but I didn't have any other way to do it at that moment. This is important so we don't judge ourselves more harshly than the one who created us. So this father not only blesses his son when he gets home, but he blesses him when he leaves. Go. I give you the money and I give you permission. And it's a big risk, but I love you. And it's up to you. But my love will follow you. Very, very beautiful. And when he comes back, he doesn't want to hear his son's speech. He just has been watching and waiting. And he runs out and greets him, throws his arms around him. Get the best robe, get the ring, get the sandals, kill the fatted calf. Let's celebrate. My son was dead and has come back to life. This is the Father who loves us when we return. How does the Father deal with the older son, who he's supposedly collaborating with, but I wonder if there was much collaboration around the estate. He's seen as the boss, and he can't get out of that role. His son is slaving for him and not collaborating as a young man who grows up and takes on his adulthood. So he refuses to come to the feast, and the father goes out. It's beautiful. Come in, he urges him, come in. I want you to be around the table. I want you to see that we're a family, that we're united. I want you to receive my love and claim it. I want you to stand up in that love and become a man. Come in. Your brother has died and come back to life. Your brother was lost and is found. It's only right that we should celebrate. So this Father, it's something for us to look at the Father's love and to see how unconditional it is. In some ways, many of us were taught to feel guilty and to sort of come crawling on our knees and beating ourselves and so on. And the Father isn't really looking at the fault. The Father is looking to say, I'm rejoicing, I'm so happy. And what the Father wants so much is that we will accept the love and that we will stand up. That's what he'll do next. He'll take his son by the shoulders and he'll stand him up and say, son, you're home. And it's not going to be easy because you have to be a man. But you're loved. So you're safe. You're loved. And I affirm you, who you are, with all your beauty and all your gifts and all your darkness. I love you. And I want you to claim that love and to say, yes, I am a beloved. And I have a right to walk in the world. And my duty and my mission is to give that love to others. I think Rembrandt doesn't, he's an artist, so he doesn't paint the actual scene that is described in Scripture, the father running out and hugging the son and the feast, and he paints something else. But it's because he so much identifies and understands that love of the Father, because he's so empty himself, and he loved so much. He also was very artistic and passionate and creative. And everything was taken from him, but the love was there. And that's why he could depict an image for us that is so, so amazing, and that has depths and depths and depths behind as we get into the picture and as we see it. This son is accepted. Both sons are accepted as they are. He trusts them. And what he wants to say is, I need you to stand up now because I'm going to disappear, and you will be the one to show my love, to welcome people home, to love unconditionally, to stop judging, to stop running away, to stop squandering the gifts that you have been given. I affirm you as you are today, with the shame and the guilt, but with the gifts that I've given you for the kingdom. That's who this father is. And what Henri realized was that his mission and his call was to become the father, and to be the one not only who is blessed, but who is also blessing others. And when I said at the beginning that Henri was transformed, that is the truth. Henri gradually became like this father, so much more listening, so much more accepting, so humble, but so caring. And all these little gestures of enormous generosity and kindness, pouring himself out for the people who were in front of him, and trying to love those who were difficult. It was beautiful to watch. It was torturous, but it was beautiful to watch it. So what does it mean for you and I? And I just come to that because Henri broke it open for us. What he says is, this is one of my favorite stories. It's a very intimate story for me. And he says, I hope that it will become an intimate story for you, your most intimate story. He says, you can hear what I say, but there's a whole world there for you because your life has been different than mine. And this can also become your most intimate story, where you discover that God has loved you with an everlasting love, that your name is written in the palm of God's hand, that God thinks of you, that God is not wanting speeches and not wanting shame and guilt, but wanting to say, just come into the love and accept it and say yes to it and stand up and do it for others. Be a person who is loving and peaceful on the planet. And let your love flow to others, and try not to be judgmental. If you yourself have been forgiven and loved so unconditionally, do it for your brother or your sister, because they deserve it. So that's the story for us. We hear it from Henri, but our task is to accept it. Excuse me. To claim it. to say yes, and to choose the truth. I am the beloved daughter of God. And that's enough. My life is a disaster, but it's okay, because I'm loved. I can't hold it together for 5 minutes. That's the way Henri was. But it was okay. And we knew that, we experienced it, and you have too, that the people in your life that are difficult to love, but you love them, so it's okay. We're called. I'd like to end with a story about one of the people who lives at Daybreak. His name is David, and he's a man with an intellectual disability. He's been there for 40 years. And David and I are very good friends. And David is very social, and he loves people and very personable, and very obviously with a disability. So he's suffered because people have teased him, and he's felt that. But somehow he just keeps going. And so this day, David was... the thing about David is that he says things, and you don't know where they come from, but they're so right on that it's very hard. One story, we had a flood in the kitchen, and the water was pouring out under the sink. The pipe broke, and about an inch of water on the floor. So we were all running and mops and trying to, and there was all confusion. And Dave came in from work with his big work boots on and his work clothes and everything, and he stood in the door looking, and then he just stepped right into the middle of the water, and he put his hand up and he said, "Save the women and children, I can swim." One night I said, "Oh, Dave," I said, I'm so tired. Do you think you could carry me up the stairs to bed?" Dave rocks a little bit. He said, "I would, but I'd need a crane." So this story was that David likes to answer the telephone. And again, he's very personable. So somebody calls and says, "Could I please speak to Sue?" He says, "Well, yes." He said, "Now, what is your name?" And the person tells them and says, "Well, when did you meet Sue?" So then they sort of tell that story. And then, so now what were you going to talk to her about tonight? And then, "Now, do you have any children? Are you married? What are your children's names?" And then he says, "Well, Sue's not home, but so just give me your phone number." But he's not very good with the numbers. But that doesn't matter, because he said, "You know that man, he met you at that retreat, and he has 4 sons, and their names are so on." He called, and he wants to talk to you about the meeting you're going to next week. So anyway, the phone rang one day, and Dave answered, and the operator said, "I have a collect call for anyone from Joe Egan. Will you accept the charge?" Dave said, "No." He said, "Joe's not home." So the operator said, No. She said, "This is a collect call from Joe for anyone. Could you accept the call?" And he said, "No." He said, "Joe went to Boston for the weekend." And so Joe is on the other end of the line, and Joe says, "Dave, just say yes. Just say yes." The operator said, "Excuse me, sir. If you don't wish to pay for this call, please don't speak to your party." So then there was a very, very long pause, and Dave said, "Oh, Joe, there's a call here for you. What should I do?" So I simply want to say that I think there's a call here. I think we're called. And this parable and this painting and this man who has broken it open for us, it reveals to us something about the God who calls us. And it reveals something very, very important, that the central mystery of God is unconditional love. And it's hard for us to believe that anybody could love us with so much love. It's very hard. Because we are our own worst enemies. We can't look in the mirror and say, aren't I beautiful and I'm wonderful. We're saying I'm not, I'm too this, I don't have enough of that, I need more. And when is the day? You know, like Dave, we're sort of deflecting the call all the time. Dave is, you know, Joe's not here. We're getting the lines all crossed here. God is calling us. You are my beloved sons and daughters. As the Father has loved me, I have loved you. I have loved you with an everlasting love. You are mine. This is what God is saying to you and to me. And this is one place where we can really hear that call. But there's so many other places in Scripture where God is calling us and saying, I love you. And what I want is that you will say yes to that, because that will help you to stand up. And that will help you to announce love in the world. And if anything is needed today, it's love. So I just finish with Henri's words, and this is what he says at the end of his book on the prodigal son. I stand with awe at the place where Rembrandt has brought me. He led me from the kneeling, disheveled young son to the standing, bent-over old father, from the place of being blessed to the place of blessing. As I look at my own aging hands, I know that they have been given to me to stretch out towards all who suffer, to rest upon the shoulders of all who come, and to offer the blessing that emerges from the immensity of God's love.
Well, thank you, Sister Sue. That was wonderful. Well, it is about 9 o'clock, so for any of you who need to leave, you're certainly welcome to do that. For those of you who would like to stay, we'll have about 20 to 25 minutes of discussion and questions. We'll place 2 standing microphones, one here and one there. And if you have a question or a comment, if you would please come to the microphone so that we can hear through the mic system, that would be wonderful. And Sue will be glad to comment and answer questions.
Please feel free to comment if something touched you. I think it's good that you hear from one another. Those are things that might help.
Thank you very, very much. I thought that Henri Nouwen was here tonight. I think he is.
Thank you.
He was here at Collegeville for a full year, some maybe 30 years ago. And at that time I was doing different kinds of dishes and assigning rooms, and I discovered that he was at the Ecumenical Center.
Yes.
And I thought, where would he eat? I called him up. Where you plan to eat? I haven't thought about that, he said. I said, well, I'm at the seminary there's a place at the table for you. He came practically every day. But I want to say how jealous I was that he had these students. The students had him in informal conversations, what Henri, I know, loved to do. I had too many dishes and too many papers to attend to. I couldn't get there. But it was a sheer delight to have the presence of Henri. And one of the comments he made when he left here was, this ought to be a place for that continued sharing. And now, it's how many years later, the sharing continues on.
That's right.
So again, there's plenty of talk for others that we've been blessed, not only then, way back then, now and evermore. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Mother. Thank you.
I want to just share a little story about Henri. I also had a breakdown many years ago at Sauk Center, and I had lost my job in ministry and was very depressed, but we were expecting a child, and I was working at the little library in Sauk Center, and Henri called from Harvard, I think it was. And he reached Monica at home, and she said he's at the library. And so Henri called the library, surprised the librarian. But he said, "Is Richard there?" And I came to the phone, and I said, "Henri, I'm interested in getting back into ministry." And so we got a calm conversation, a nice conversation about my hopes and dreams, and it was very calm. And then I said, "And Henri, we're also expecting a baby." And then Henri got all excited, and I hadn't even been excited myself. But he opened something up for me that I hadn't been aware of myself. And we have a variety of different callings, and mine maybe wasn't so much in work in the church so much, but it was for us and Monica of having a child, Paul. And he was so open to all kinds of people.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget that beautiful expression that that's what excited him.
Right.
And he was able to see that generosity.
Wonderful. Thank you.
In my years of involvement in ecumenical dialogue, particularly the Mennonite Catholic dialogue, I have been impressed again and again and again by the impact that Henri Nouwen had on Protestants. He was a very important ecumenical voice.
Yes.
I think the fact that his academic career was spent in Protestant seminaries says something. The video clip we saw tonight was in a Protestant church.
Yeah.
He was somehow able to remain completely Catholic. I'm not aware anybody has ever accused him of not being a good Catholic. But he was able to do that in a way that brought Protestants across this barrier of hostility and misunderstanding that is just always there. That I've always wondered, was he aware of the impact that his writing was having on the whole ecumenical process?
I think that possibly he was. I think the fact was that he was invited a lot more by people from denominations other than Catholic to talk and to give things. I think, and that was a bit wounding for him in some ways, because of course he would have liked to have been called forth in his own church. But I don't think he had so much knowledge about his writing. I have certainly learned that. I mean, because I've been working with his papers and so on for the last many years, and he's been named as the second most read author by the Protestant churches. So that was the wonderful gift when he came to Daybreak, because we were founded by a couple from the Anglican Church. I was a Roman Catholic nun. There was a Jewish woman. There was, so we had all these things, and we'd try to have a worship service, and then the whole place would explode afterwards because we did it wrong. And then we were mad at each other, and then everybody was scared to try to get a service together. So we said to Henri, we don't know how to do this, and you don't know how to do it, but let's try to do it together. And he said, good, let's do that. And so he listened. But the first thing he said to us was, we are people called by God from different traditions. And he said, this is a gift, not a problem. That changed everything. This is a gift. It's not a problem. And sometimes we'd have services, and then he would say, now, everybody from a different tradition, they would take a flower, and then in the middle of the service, they'd come and put it in a vase, and then we'd have this gorgeous bouquet of all different flowers. And then he'd hold it up and say, see, aren't we lucky? Isn't this beautiful? And of course, we would never. We were just trying to find our way and killing each other along the way and so on. And he went right out and met all the ministers from the different churches in our area, invited them to come and celebrate, and he was amazing. And then with our Jewish people, one man was 54, and his father was 84, and he had always wanted to make his bar mitzvah and had never been allowed. So Henri went to a Jewish community. There was a little kahila, and he went and they worked together, and Mel memorized some of the things. Anyway, we all went to his bar mitzvah. His father just sat there with the tears streaming down his face. And those people have come for 20 years, every year for the Seder Supper, and they lead our community through the Seder Supper. So, I mean, it's amazing what he did. It's great. Amazing.
Sister Sue, you talked about how anguished Henri was. Did that anguish lessen as he became more accepting of God's unconditional love as he grew older?
You know, it's very hard to know, because it's not something that he talked about. So he lived it. But I lived in the same house with him, and so I could see. And then, of course, he had this breakdown and so on. So very, very hard to say. I would say that one of the biggest transformations for Henri was in his body. When he came, he was like a board. And of course, everybody at L'Arche Daybreak, we hug each other. So people with disabilities, especially people with Down syndrome, they're real affectionate. So they come and, and you give Henri a hug, and it was like hugging a board. I mean, just so stiff. And that over the years was just, and he says that. We asked him to take care of one of the people who was very, very disabled. His name was Adam. And he couldn't do anything for himself. He was a man with severe, severe epilepsy, and couldn't walk, couldn't talk, couldn't eat, so everything had to be done. And when Henri first came, that was his work. He had to help Adam with his morning routine, and he wrote a book about it. It's very good. And but he was just terrified. He was absolutely terrified, because he had never done anything like that. He had to get him up in the morning, get his bath, get him dressed, get him to the breakfast table, make his breakfast, help him to eat, get him in his wheelchair, take him to his day program. And Adam never spoke. Henri wrote a beautiful, beautiful book called Adam, God's Beloved, and it's Adam's story, but what he says in the story is, he says, Adam became my friend, my teacher, and my guide. He was not a friend like most friends, and he didn't teach like most teachers, and he didn't point like most guides. But of all the books and all the spiritual directors that I've ever had, Adam has taught me most about the spiritual life and about God. He just said Adam just gave himself to him, and it was so sacred to give him his bath and to spend time with him and to splash and make him enjoy the bath and to he said Adam just gave himself totally to me and became my brother. But the first days were terrible. He said, why do you ask me to do this? Why don't you give me someone easy to look after? I don't want to look after Adam. And he said, I never expected to have a relationship with him because Adam didn't talk. And he said, my whole education was books and speaking. And so in that silent 2 hours together in the morning, Adam just transformed Henri. So I can't tell you about the depths. I know that there were times, I mean, one of the things that was evident to me was in the middle of the night, he was calling people in Europe, so he didn't sleep well. And I had a lot of friends in Europe, and of course it's 6 hours ahead of time, so at 3 o'clock in the morning, and again, in the same house, hello there, how are you? And we're all trying to sleep. I don't really know. I just know that we were all, something really good was happening. We were growing together. I mean, his death was very sudden and it was very, very traumatic for us. But again, that was the moment that we had to stand up and say, are we going to just sit back now or are we going to carry on? And we had plans to build a chapel and a retreat center and we built the chapel like 3 years later. And our chapel is used by students and people coming and so on. So he gave us this amazing gift.
Sister Susan, I think there's Benedictine sisters here who could tell this better than I, but they're probably more demure. You mentioned that one of his sorrows was maybe not being called forth by the Catholic community as much as by other Christian communities. Some years ago, he was called forth by the Benedictine sisters over in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, St. Bede's Monastery, and spent, I don't know if it was a whole semester, but it wasn't just a couple of weeks.
No.
It was a good number of months.
Yeah.
I happened to be bringing someone over there to visit, and he was quite triumphant that they had just established, I cannot say it the way he would in his accent, but a place of prayer.
Yes.
And he was kind of, now we have a place of prayer. Not all in that community were particularly, they thought they already did have a place of prayer, but they thought he was upstaging them a little, but he was very happy.
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you again, Sue, for a beautiful, beautiful evening, and thank you to each of you for joining us.
Thanks very much.